3 years ago, I purchased my dream property, 5 acres of woodland with a natural stream running through it, situated just on the edge of the upscale Pinecrest Estates development. I had worked as a civil engineer specializing in water management for nearly 15 years before deciding to apply my expertise to my own land. The property was perfect, but it came with challenges. The hillside location meant that during heavy rains, water would flow downhill directly toward the newer developments below. I spent the first 6 months studying the land, testing soil composition, and tracking water flow patterns through different weather conditions. Many evenings, I would stand in the rain with surveying equipment, measuring how water moved across my property. The neighbors probably thought I was eccentric, but I understood something they did not. Water always finds a path, and controlling that path is essential. After careful planning, I began constructing a sophisticated dam and retention pond system. Not the massive concrete structures most people imagine, but rather a series of strategically placed earthen berms, small concrete weirs, and native plant reinforcements that would slow, control, and redirect water during heavy rain events. I installed overflow channels, sluice gates that could be adjusted based on rainfall predictions, and a series of settlement ponds that would clean the water as it moved through my property. The system was both functional and beautiful. Visitors would often comment on the lovely ponds and waterscapes, not realizing they were looking at carefully engineered flood control infrastructure. During the first significant rainfall after completion, I monitored everything with scientific precision. The system performed flawlessly, reducing downstream flow by nearly 70% during peak rain and releasing the stored water gradually over the following days. For 2 years, my system protected both my land and the Pinecrest neighborhood below. Spring storms, summer downpours, even a minor hurricane that passed through our region, my dam system handled them all. The natural areas downstream from my property remained stable with no erosion issues, and the neighborhood never experienced any flooding despite several record-breaking rainfall events. The Pinecrest Estates Homeowners Association had never bothered me. My property sat just outside their jurisdiction, and while I attended a few community events, I largely kept to myself, content to maintain my sanctuary and its water management system. That changed when Barbara Thompson retired as HOA president and Melissa Kent, known to everyone simply as Karen, took over the position. I still remember that Tuesday afternoon when the certified letter arrived. The return address showed the Pinecrest Estates HOA logo, which immediately struck me as odd since my property was not part of their association. I opened it, expecting perhaps an invitation to a community event or a general neighborhood announcement. Instead, I found a formal letter written in cold, legal language. "Dear property owner," it began, "it has come to our attention that you have constructed unauthorized water retention structures that violate the Pinecrest Estates aesthetic guidelines and potentially pose health and safety risks to the community. As per our recently expanded oversight jurisdiction, you are hereby ordered to remove all such structures within 30 days of receipt of this notice, or face legal action and daily fines." I read the letter 3 times, trying to understand how this could be happening. My dam system was fully permitted by the county, engineered to professional standards, and most importantly, protected their neighborhood from potential flooding. What expanded oversight jurisdiction were they claiming? The letter was signed with a flourish, "Melissa Kent, President, Pinecrest Estates HOA." A storm was coming, but not the kind my dam was built to handle. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Monday evening. I spent the weekend preparing a comprehensive presentation on my water management system. I printed detailed engineering diagrams, collected flow rate data, and even created a small physical model demonstrating how the system protected the Pinecrest neighborhood from potential flooding during heavy rains. I arrived 30 minutes early, setting up my materials methodically at the front of the community center meeting room. As board members and residents filtered in, I introduced myself politely to each person, explaining that I would be discussing the water system on my property. Most seemed curious rather than hostile. Then Melissa Kent, Karen, walked in. She wore an expensive suit and carried a leather portfolio that she slapped down on the table with authority. I extended my hand in greeting. "I am Robert, the owner of the hillside property with the water management system. I have brought some information that I think will address your concerns," I said. Karen barely glanced at my outstretched hand. "We have a full agenda tonight. You will have 3 minutes during public comments, the same as anyone else," she replied before turning away to speak with another board member. The meeting began with standard HOA business, approving previous minutes, discussing a new landscaping contract, debating whether the community pool should close at 9:00 or 10:00 during summer months. When public comments finally began, I was the third person called. I walked to the podium, carrying my most important diagrams. "Good evening. I am here to discuss the water management system on my property that was referenced in a recent letter I received," I began. "This system has been in place for over 2 years and is fully permitted by the county. It actually protects the Pinecrest neighborhood by controlling water runoff during heavy rains. Without it, properties downhill would be at significant risk of flooding. I have brought engineering documents and flow control data to demonstrate." "Thank you for your comments," Karen interrupted, looking at her watch. "Your 3 minutes are up." I looked at the large digital clock on the wall. "I have only spoken for 50 seconds, I pointed out. Karen's face hardened. "Mr. Roberts." "It is Robert," I corrected. "Whatever. The HOA board has already reviewed your situation and made its determination. That unsightly collection of ponds and dirt mounds is visible from Pinecrest properties and violates our aesthetic standards. Our jurisdiction now extends to properties that impact the visual harmony of our community, as voted on during our special session last month." I tried again. "But this is not just decorative. These are engineered flood control structures. Without them during heavy rains, water will flow directly into—" "Are you an attorney, Mr. Robert?" Karen asked sharply. "No, but I am a civil engineer specializing in—" "Then I suggest you do not try to interpret legal matters. Our HOA counsel has confirmed our authority in this matter," she stated, tapping her manicured nails on the table. I looked around at the other 4 board members. 2 avoided eye contact completely. One older gentleman, Tom McAllister, looked uncomfortable, fidgeting with his pen. Only Janet Weber, a newer board member, spoke up. "Perhaps we should at least review the engineering documentation. If there are safety concerns," Janet began. "The decision has been made," Karen said firmly. "Next speaker, please." I stood there, stunned by the abrupt dismissal. As I gathered my materials, I noticed several residents looking at me with sympathetic expressions, but no one else spoke up. I left my business card with each board member except Karen, who had already turned away. The following week, I hired a private investigator, primarily to determine how the HOA could possibly claim jurisdiction over my non-HOA property. What he discovered was illuminating. Karen had recently purchased 3 investment properties within Pinecrest Estates, all located in the lowest part of the neighborhood, the very area most protected by my water management system. She had gotten them at below-market prices because the previous owners had disclosed minor water issues during heavy rains, before my system was built. I consulted with a lawyer who specialized in property disputes. After reviewing my documents and the HOA claims, he sighed heavily. They are overstepping their authority, but fighting this could cost you $20,000 to $30,000 in legal fees, with no guarantee of success. HOAs have tremendous power in this state, and courts tend to give them wide latitude. 2 days later, a courier delivered a cease and desist letter, threatening daily fines of $500 if I did not remove my unauthorized structures within 2 weeks. The deadline had been shortened from the original 30 days. As a last resort, I requested to speak at the monthly neighborhood-wide meeting, hoping to appeal directly to the residents. I prepared carefully, focusing on the potential flooding risks to their homes. The meeting room was packed with over 60 homeowners. Karen called on me last, after nearly 2 hours of tedious discussions about lawn height restrictions and garbage can placement rules. Many of you may not know me, I began, but my property sits just above Pinecrest on the hillside. I have been ordered by the HOA to remove the water management system that currently protects many of your homes from flooding during heavy rains. Before I am forced to do this, I want you to understand the potential consequences. I had just started displaying my first diagram when Karen stood up. "Let me clarify something for everyone," she announced loudly. "Mr. Robert here has built an ugly series of ditches and ponds that violate our community standards. He is not a licensed hydrologist, and his amateur doomsday predictions are designed to frighten you. I am actually a licensed civil engineer with 15 years of experience in water management," I interjected. Karen smiled condescendingly. "A civil engineer who built an unsightly mess visible from our community. The board has reviewed this matter extensively, and our decision is final." She turned to address the crowd directly. "Does anyone here want to look at dirt mounds and stagnant water from their back porch? Does anyone want their property values to drop because of one person's refusal to comply with reasonable aesthetic standards?" The room remained silent. I stood alone at the podium, engineering diagrams in hand, as Karen effectively turned the entire room against me with strategic mischaracterizations and appeals to property values. As I left the meeting, rain had begun to fall outside, the first serious storm of the season, sending water directly into my carefully engineered system, the system they were demanding I destroy. The final notice arrived exactly 1 week later, printed on heavy cardstock with the HOA logo embossed in gold at the top. The language left no room for interpretation. Final notice: you are hereby ordered to remove all unauthorized water structures on your property within 10 days. Failure to comply will result in legal action including but not limited to daily fines of $500, property liens, and court-ordered removal at your expense. That same morning, I had been reviewing the seasonal weather forecast, which predicted an unusually active storm season. The meteorologist on the local news had used phrases like potential record-breaking rainfall and sustained precipitation patterns. The computer models showed a series of large storm systems lined up across the Pacific, heading directly for our region with unusual persistence. I contacted the County Environmental Protection Office immediately, explaining the situation and the potential flooding risk to the neighborhood. The representative listened patiently, and I could hear her typing notes as I spoke. "I understand your concern, Mr. Robert," she said. "Unfortunately, this appears to be a private property dispute between you and the homeowners association. While your water management system was properly permitted, we cannot intervene in what is essentially a legal matter between private parties. But there is significant risk of property damage and potentially even personal injury if this system is removed before the rainy season," I explained. "I sympathize with your situation," she replied, her voice genuinely concerned. "I can make a note in our system and possibly send someone out to evaluate the situation, but I have to be honest, unless there is an actual environmental emergency in progress, our hands are largely tied. These property jurisdiction disputes need to be resolved before we can take any action." I called 4 more government offices that day: the county commissioner, the State Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Natural Resources, and even the Army Corps of Engineers, since my property contained what could technically be classified as wetlands. Each conversation ended the same way: sympathetic words but no actual assistance unless the dispute with the HOA was resolved. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a calculator, a notepad, and a glass of whiskey. The financial reality was stark. Fighting the HOA in court would cost at minimum $25,000 in legal fees, according to the attorney I consulted. The daily fines of $500 would amount to $15,000 per month if I chose to ignore the order. My savings account contained just under $30,000, money I had been setting aside for years to eventually build a workshop on my property. The math was simple and devastating. I could spend every penny I had saved fighting a legal battle I might well lose, or I could comply with their demand and remove the dam system I had spent countless hours designing and building. The system that protected not only my property but theirs as well. Sleep eluded me that night. I lay awake watching the ceiling fan rotate slowly above my bed, creating circular shadows that reminded me of water spiraling down a drain. Each calculation I ran through my mind led to the same conclusion: I simply could not afford this fight. The next morning, I rose before dawn with a clear plan. If I was going to be forced to remove my water management system, I would document everything meticulously first. I spent the entire day photographing every component from multiple angles, recording water flow measurements, and creating detailed diagrams of how each element functioned within the overall system. I took video footage explaining the purpose of each structure and demonstrating how they work together to control water flow during heavy rains. I also wrote a comprehensive report predicting what would likely happen once the system was removed, including flow rate calculations and potential flooding zones based on topographical data. This documentation served 2 purposes: evidence of the system's importance and protection against potential liability if my predictions proved accurate. For 3 more days, I continued documenting while simultaneously researching any possible legal loopholes or alternatives. Each avenue led to the same dead end. Without substantial financial resources, I could not fight this battle. The rain began falling more frequently, sometimes in short, violent bursts that tested my system's capacity. It performed perfectly, catching and holding the water, then releasing it slowly after each storm passed. But the larger systems on the weather radar were still approaching, and the ground was already becoming saturated. On the 7th day after receiving the final notice, I stood in the rain beside my primary retention pond, watching the water level rise exactly as my calculations had predicted. Small streams flowed through the carefully designed channels into the settling basins, where the water slowed and cleared before continuing its controlled journey downhill. The system was beautiful in its functionality, an elegant solution to a natural problem. I made my decision with a heavy heart but clear mind. The next morning, I began calling local contractors to help dismantle what I had so carefully built. The crew arrived early Monday morning, 3 men with 2 small excavators and a dump truck. They were from Johnson Excavation, a local company I had specifically chosen because their owner, Mike Johnson, had some background in environmental work and might understand the significance of what we were doing. I walked him through the system, explaining the purpose of each component and what would happen when they were removed. "This seems like good engineering," Mike commented, surveying the primary retention pond. "Why exactly are you tearing it down?" I handed him a copy of the HOA notice. He skimmed it and shook his head. "HOAs," he muttered. "Got into a 2-year fight with mine over the height of my fence. Ended up moving rather than dealing with them anymore." He looked up at the cloudy sky. "Bad timing too, with all this rain coming." The work began with the smallest elements first, removing the flow control gates that regulated water movement between ponds. A small crowd began to gather as the machinery roared to life. Several of my immediate neighbors, who did not live within the Pinecrest estate's boundaries, watched with obvious concern. "What is happening here?" asked Maria Garcia, whose property adjoined mine on the eastern border. She had always appreciated my water system, as it had resolved minor drainage issues that had previously affected her garden. "I have been ordered to remove the entire water management system," I explained, showing her the notice. "But why? This has been good for everyone," she said, genuinely confused. Another neighbor, David Chen, joined the conversation. "Is this because of that HOA down the hill? They cannot tell you what to do on your own property. You are not even part of their association. They are claiming expanded jurisdictional authority based on aesthetic impact to their community," I explained. "Fighting them in court would cost more money than I can afford right now." As our conversation continued, more neighbors gathered. Word spread quickly, and soon nearly a dozen people were watching the dismantling process with growing concern. The excavator had already removed 2 critical overflow channels and was beginning work on the main retention basin. An elderly man I had not met before approached, using a walking stick for support. He introduced himself as Harold Winters and explained that he had lived in the area for over 50 years. "Young man, do they understand what they are asking you to do?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "Before any of these fancy houses were built, this whole area flooded regularly. Back in 1978, we had a season much like the forecasters are predicting now. The water came down this hillside like a freight train, took out 3 houses that used to sit right where that HOA neighborhood is now." Harold pointed with his walking stick toward the lowest part of Pinecrest Estates. "That whole area down there was underwater for nearly 2 weeks. That is why nobody built there for years afterward. Then developers came in, put in some basic drainage, and started selling lots like nothing had ever happened." His words sent a chill through the gathering crowd. I had researched local flooding history when designing my system, but had not heard this first-hand account. "Did you try telling the HOA about this?" I asked. Harold laughed bitterly. "Tried talking to that woman in charge last month when I saw them surveying near your property line. She told me that modern homes do not have flooding issues, and that I should not worry my elderly mind about such things." As our conversation continued, a sleek black SUV drove slowly past my property. Through the tinted windows, I could make out Karen's face, watching the dismantling with unmistakable satisfaction. She drove by again 20 minutes later, and then a third time shortly before lunch. Each time, she slowed nearly to a stop, observing the destruction of my carefully engineered system. By mid-afternoon, the crew had removed most of the secondary elements. The main retention pond had been partially drained, and the earthen berms that directed water flow were being flattened. Each scoop of the excavator felt like a physical pain, as if the machines were tearing away pieces of myself rather than just earth and concrete. "This is not right," Mike Johnson said during their break. "I have seen enough water management systems to know this one was well designed. With all this rain coming," he trailed off, looking at the darkening sky. "Just following orders," I replied, the phrase tasting bitter in my mouth. The work continued throughout the day, more neighbors stopping by to watch and express their concern. By late afternoon, nearly all the secondary structures had been removed. All that remained was the main retention pond and its primary outflow channel, the heart of the entire system. As the excavators moved into position to begin the final phase of dismantling, a distant rumble of thunder rolled across the hills. Dark clouds had been gathering throughout the day, but now they massed overhead with ominous intensity. The weather forecast had predicted the first major storm of the season would arrive that night, earlier than initially expected. Karen's SUV made one final pass just as the excavators began tearing into the main retention basin. This time she rolled down her window, not even attempting to hide her presence. Our eyes met briefly as another thunder crack split the air. A small, satisfied smile played across her lips as she drove away. The crew worked until dusk, removing the last critical elements of the water management system. As they loaded their equipment onto trailers, the first heavy raindrops began to fall. The timing could not have been more dramatic, the final barrier removed just as the skis opened. Mike Johnson gave me a concerned look as he prepared to leave. "Good luck," he said simply, knowing that words were inadequate for the situation. I stood alone in the increasing rain, watching water already beginning to form new, uncontrolled channels where my carefully designed system had once directed the flow. Nature abhors a vacuum, and water always finds a path. The path now led directly toward Pinecrest Estates, with nothing to slow its journey. For 3 days, the rain fell without ceasing. Not the violent downpours that sometimes characterized our region's storms, but a steady, persistent rainfall that gave the ground no opportunity to dry. Local news stations reported rainfall totals already approaching record levels, with the main storm system still offshore and moving our direction. From my home office window, I monitored the hillside where my water management system had once functioned. The changes were subtle at first, small rivulets forming where there had previously been none, water pooling in depressions that had once been part of a controlled flow pattern. But by the fourth day, the changes had become unmistakable. I took out my binoculars for a better view of the developing situation. Where the main retention pond had once held back thousands of gallons of water, releasing it slowly through regulated channels, there was now an uncontrolled flow steadily carving a deeper path down the hillside. The water, stained brown with sediment that would previously have settled in my retention basins, was cutting new channels directly toward the lowest section of the Pinecrest neighborhood, the area where Karen had purchased her investment properties. My computer displayed the latest weather alerts, another atmospheric river approaching, moisture levels unprecedented for this time of year. The ground, already saturated, could absorb no more water. Everything that fell now would flow downhill, gathering speed and volume as it moved. I composed a formal letter to the HOA board, documenting the changing water patterns with photographs and precise measurements. My language was neutral and scientific, focusing on observable facts rather than accusations or warnings. I delivered printed copies to each board member's home that afternoon, walking door to door in the steady rain with my documentation in waterproof folders. Karen was not home when I delivered her copy, but Janet Weber, the board member who had attempted to speak up at the meeting, answered her door and invited me in from the rain. "I want you to know I voted against this," she said quietly, glancing through the documentation I had provided. "Tom McAllister did too, but we were outvoted 3-2. "Do you understand what is happening now?" I asked. Janet nodded, concern evident on her face. "I have noticed water in my backyard where it has never been before, and the Thompsons down on Oak Ridge Drive said their basement had moisture coming in yesterday." "It will get worse," I said simply, "much worse." The next morning, every homeowner in Pinecrest Estates received an email from Karen, copied to all residents. I obtained a copy from Janet, who forwarded it to me immediately. "Dear Pinecrest community members," the email began, "it has come to my attention that a certain individual is attempting to create panic regarding normal seasonal rainfall. As your HOA president, I want to assure you that our community drainage systems are fully functional and designed to modern standards. The amateur warning some of you may have received is nothing but fear-mongering from someone upset about being required to comply with our community aesthetic standards. Please disregard these unfounded concerns and direct any questions to the HOA board rather than unqualified individuals." The email was signed with her name and title, followed by a quote about maintaining property values through community standards. No mention was made of the specific concerns I had raised or the photographic evidence I had provided. That evening the calls began. The first came from a homeowner named Michael Brennan, whose property sat on the lowest street in the development. "There is water pooling along my foundation," he reported, his voice tense with concern. "This has never happened before, not even during the big storms 2 years ago." 3 more calls came in that night, all from residents in the lower section of the neighborhood, all reporting unusual water accumulation. I listened patiently to each caller, explaining that without my water management system, there was nothing I could legally do to help them. I suggested they document everything and contact their insurance companies immediately. By the 6th day of rain, the situation had deteriorated significantly. The newly formed channels on my property had deepened, carrying increasing volumes of water directly toward Pinecrest Estates. The ground had become so saturated that water barely penetrated the surface anymore, instead flowing immediately downhill, gathering speed and debris as it moved. I spent that evening answering more calls from increasingly panicked neighbors. Around 9 o'clock, Janet Weber called with news that the Hendersons on Creekside Lane had discovered 6 inches of water in their garage. 2 other homes on the same street were experiencing similar problems. Late that night, I stood at my kitchen window, watching flashlight beams dancing through the rain as homeowners inspected their properties in the darkness. The steady drumming of rainfall on my roof had become the soundtrack to an unfolding disaster. My phone continued to ring with calls from desperate residents, but there was nothing I could do except listen to their growing panic. I tried to warn them, I whispered to the darkness. I showed them exactly what would happen. The 7th day brought the heaviest rainfall yet. The weather radar showed a massive system stalled directly over our region, continuously drawing moisture from the ocean and dumping it onto already saturated ground. Local news reported flash flood warnings throughout the county, with our area specifically mentioned as a high-risk zone. From my property, I could now see water flowing in sheets down the hillside, no longer confined to the newly cut channels but spreading across the entire slope. The earth could absorb no more. Everything that fell now was moving inexorably toward the neighborhood below, gathering force with every foot of elevation it dropped. The warning signs had been clear for days. Now the real disaster was about to begin. The main storm system arrived with apocalyptic intensity. Rain fell not in drops but in sheets, reducing visibility to mere feet. Wind drove the water horizontally, finding every gap in clothing, every vulnerable point in home construction. Local meteorologists used terms like hundred-year storm and unprecedented rainfall totals as they struggled to communicate the severity of what was happening. From my hilltop vantage point, I could see the Pinecrest neighborhood beginning to transform. What had started as puddles in yards and damp spots in basements had progressed to standing water in the lowest streets. The community drainage system, designed for normal rainfall patterns, was completely overwhelmed. Storm drains gurgled uselessly, already filled beyond capacity. The first serious flooding began in the southeastern corner of the development, precisely where my water management system would have provided the most protection. Residents waded through knee-deep water, attempting to move vehicles to higher ground. Some had started stacking sandbags around their foundations, a futile gesture given the volume of water now flowing toward them. Emergency services were stretched thin across the entire region. When I turned on the police scanner, I heard dispatchers repeatedly telling callers that help would come as soon as units are available. The entire county was experiencing flooding, with multiple water rescues already in progress elsewhere. By mid-afternoon, water had risen to the doorsteps of at least a dozen homes in Pinecrest Estates. From my window, I could see residents frantically moving possessions to upper floors. Cars abandoned in the lowest areas now sat with water reaching their door handles. The community clubhouse had been opened as an emergency shelter, and people were making their way there with hastily packed bags and confused pets on leashes. Without the regulated release that my dam system had provided, water now moved down the hillside in a continuous, strengthening flow. The ground had become a saturated sponge that could hold no more moisture. Every drop of rain that fell now moved downhill immediately, joining the growing flood. The County Emergency Management Office issued a flash flood warning specifically for the Pinecrest area at 4:30 p.m. My phone began ringing almost immediately, first Janet Weber, then Tom McAllister, and finally 3 other board members I had never spoken with directly. Each conveyed increasingly desperate questions. Was there anything that could be done? Could my water system be quickly rebuilt? Did I have any suggestions for emergency measures? I answered each call with the same painful truth. Nothing could be done now. The system that had taken months to design and build could not be recreated overnight. The volume of water already in motion could not be stopped or redirected without substantial infrastructure that simply did not exist anymore. As darkness fell, the situation deteriorated rapidly. The storm intensified, dropping nearly 2 inches of rain in a single hour. From my vantage point, I could see the headlights of emergency vehicles attempting to reach the most severely affected areas, their progress slowed by increasingly deep water. Portable generators created islands of light where power had already failed. Just after 9 p.m., the critical moment arrived. The continuous rainfall had completely saturated the hillside soil to its maximum depth. The ground could absorb no more water, and the natural slope created perfect conditions for the disaster that followed. A surge of water, not quite a flash flood but something almost as destructive, began moving down the hillside all at once. I watched through binoculars as this wall of water, 2 to 3 feet high in places, moved inexorably toward the lowest parts of Pinecrest Estates. The emergency lights cast eerie reflections on the advancing flood, creating a scene from a disaster movie. People ran from the water's path, some carrying children, others struggling with pets or hastily gathered possessions. My phone rang again. Karen's name appeared on the screen. After nearly a week of silence from her, this call spoke volumes about the severity of the situation. I answered without speaking. "Robert, are you there?" Her voice had lost all of its previous authority and condescension, replaced by naked fear. "The water is coming into my house on Creekview Lane. All 3 of my properties are flooding. The emergency services cannot get through. Is there anything at all you can do?" "The dam system that would have prevented this has been destroyed," I replied evenly. "On your orders." "But there must be something," she pleaded. "Some emergency measure, some way to divert the water. You are an engineer. You must know something that can help us." "Physics cannot be overruled by an HOA vote, Karen," I said. "Water flows downhill. Without a retention system to hold it back and release it gradually, this is the inevitable result." "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "There are families trapped down here, children, elderly people who cannot evacuate through this water." The sound of her desperation should have brought satisfaction after her previous treatment of me. Instead, it only reinforced the tragedy of the situation, a completely preventable disaster caused by arrogance and ignorance of natural systems. "Call emergency services again," I told her. "Tell them people are trapped and facing life-threatening conditions. That will prioritize their response." More calls came in over the next hour, other board members, residents I had never spoken with, even the county commissioner who had previously been unable to help with my HOA dispute. The flood had now fully engulfed the lower third of Pinecrest Estates. Water reached halfway up the doors of first-floor homes in the lowest areas, trapping residents on upper floors. Cars floated and collided in the street-stern drivers. The power failed across the entire neighborhood, plunging everything into darkness broken only by emergency lights and the occasional flashlight beam. Through my window, I could see the constellation of emergency lights growing as more rescue vehicles attempted to reach the community. Floodwaters had made many streets impassable, forcing first responders to use boats and high-water vehicles for evacuations. The rain continued falling, adding to the already catastrophic situation. My phone battery died around midnight after dozens of increasingly desperate calls. I plugged it in but did not immediately turn it back on. There was nothing more I could say, no advice I could give that would make any difference now. The disaster I had predicted, the one I had designed my entire system to prevent, was unfolding exactly as I had feared. I stood at my window for hours, watching the emergency response and evacuation efforts continue through the night. The rain finally began to ease around 3 a.m., but the flooding showed no signs of receding. The water had found the path of least resistance downhill, and that path led directly through the heart of Pinecrest Estates. Dawn broke clear and bright, creating a surreal contrast with the devastation below. From my vantage point, Pinecrest Estates resembled a lake with homes rising from it like islands. The floodwaters had receded only slightly overnight, leaving the entire lower section of the neighborhood still deeply submerged. Cars rested at odd angles, some piled against trees or fences where the water had carried them. Personal possessions scattered across yards and streets, furniture, toys, books, clothing, the detritus of disrupted lives. The human impact became visible as the light strengthened. Residents who had weathered the night in upper floors now appeared on balconies and rooftops, surveying the damage. Emergency boats continued evacuation operations, moving methodically from house to house. A medical evacuation helicopter landed briefly on the one dry section of the community park, airlifting someone in what appeared to be a critical condition. By mid-morning, the first news crews arrived, setting up camera positions on the perimeter where roads remained passable. Reporters in rain boots and waders moved through shallower areas, interviewing shell-shocked residents and first responders. Drones buzzed overhead, capturing aerial footage of the disaster for nationwide broadcast. I had spent the early morning hours organizing all my documentation: the original engineering plans for my water management system, the HOA letters demanding its removal, my warnings about potential flooding, photographs of the dismantling process, and weather data showing the predictability of this outcome. When County Inspector Davis arrived at my property around 10 a.m., I had everything: